Okay, well, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the Fayetteville Public Library. My name is Joel Bunch. I'm a librarian in our Adult Services Department, and just want to thank you all for being here. This is our second KUAF Our Word book discussion, and we're happy to host. Got a couple things I want to draw your attention to. First, there are feedback forms in your chairs. If you take a moment to fill those out, there's a box in the back where you can turn those in, and we greatly appreciate your consideration in doing so. Also in the back, we've got pearls. Daniel is selling copies of Dr. Thompson's book today, and Dr. Thompson will be doing a signing after today's program. And also there is a book display in the back highlighting different titles from the collection that are related to today's topic. So now I'm going to turn things over to Lowell Taylor, who's going to be talking a little bit more about Dr. Thompson and today's moderators.
Thank you, Joel. Thank you all for being here today. I'm so happy to see everybody. So my name is Lowell Taylor. I'm the host of the Our Word podcast, in which we're talking about reparations in the church in Northwest Arkansas. And today's event is part 2 of the Our Word book discussion series. So in the fall, we had Jamar Tisby come and talk about his book, How to Fight Racism. And today we're honored to have Dr. Greg Thompson talk about his book, Reparations. And so Greg is many things, but most importantly to me, he's a teacher and friend who has helped me on my journey towards racial justice, and believe that he can help us all on that journey together. Greg will be joined by 2 other teachers and friends of mine, Dr. Trisha Posey of JBU and Dr. Caree Banton of the University of Arkansas, who will be interviewing Greg. So I want to thank Greg, Trisha, Caree, and all of you for being here today. If you've not RSVP'd for today's event, if you will do so at reparationsnowNWA.com, that'll help us invite you to future events. We'll ask for your email address, and you can stay informed as to future events, which we hope to have. Lastly, I want to thank the Fayetteville Public Library, KUAF, the African and African American Studies program at the U of A, and the Methodist Foundation for Arkansas for their support of today's event. So with that, please welcome Dr. Greg Thompson.
Hey everybody, thank you for coming to this. My name's Gregory Thompson. I live in Charlottesville, Virginia, where I do a number of things, but one of those is related to reparations, and so thank you for coming to talk about this. I'm going to begin with something from 1967. So in 1967, the civil rights movement, the classical era of the civil rights movement, was in a form of crisis, and Martin Luther King began to work on a book called Where Do We Go From Here? Some of you are familiar with that book. It was the topic of his last speech to the SCLC in August of 67. And in the opening essay to what this book that was published posthumously, I want to just read you something that he says. He's talking about how Lyndon Johnson had sort of celebrated this notion that America had dealt the last blow to racism in its midst, and then he talks about what the state of things is a year later. This is quoting Lyndon Johnson when at the passage of the Voting Rights Bill. He says, "Today is a triumph for freedom as huge as any victory that's ever been won on any battlefield. Today we strike away the last major shackle of fierce and ancient bonds." King. 1 year later, some of the people who had been brutalized in Selma and who were present at the Capitol ceremonies were leading marchers in the suburbs of Chicago amid the rain of rocks and bottles, among burning automobiles, to the thunder of jeering thousands, many of them waving Nazi flags. A year later, the white backlash had become an emotional electoral issue in California, Maryland, and elsewhere. And in several southern states, men long regarded as political clowns had become governors or only narrowly missed election, their magic achieved with a witch's brew of bigotry, prejudice, half-truths, and whole lies. During that year, white and Negro civil rights workers have been murdered in several southern communities, and the swift and easy acquittals that followed for the accused shocked much of the nation, but sent a wave of unabashed triumph through southern segregationist circles. A year later, Ramparts magazine was asserting Quote, after more than a decade of the civil rights movement for Black American in Harlem, Haynesville, Baltimore, these cities are worse off today than they were 10 years ago. The movement's leaders know it, and it is the source of their despair. The movement is in despair because it has been forced to recognize that the Negro Revolution is a myth. He's writing this 2 years after the passage of the Voting Rights Act, after Lyndon Johnson declares that we had triumphed over racism. Now, 50 years to the month after King wrote that, I watched Klansmen in the Unite the Right rally march through the streets of my neighborhood in Charlottesville, Virginia, and kill a woman outside of my office by running over her with a car. 3 years after that, we watched George Floyd get murdered, and we watched white Americans change the subject to CRT in its wake. And I think now this question that King was asking in '67 is the question that I have had now, which is, where do we go from here? What are we going to do from here? And once again, I think we're faced with this question. What is going to be required of us as human beings if we are to heal from the longstanding and destructive litany of hatred that's come from American racism? Where do we go from here? I'm going to headline where I think we go from here. I think we go all in on reparations. But where we go from here depends on what you think is happening. What you think is happening and what you do depends on what you see. So what I want to do is talk about what I see and what has led me, a Southern white man, descendant of Klansmen, who looks like a fly fishing guide, to to the conclusion, the solid and life-altering conclusion that unless we are serious about reparations, we will never heal in this country. When we think about this, when we think about what we should do, I want to just give a working definition of racism that most of you will recognize immediately. I want to say that it has three parts. First, it is the designation of human beings as distinct from one another based on putatively fixed biological capacities, okay, our biological characteristics. That's the first thing, this distinction among these putatively biological fixed characteristics. Secondly, the assignment of value to people in terms of their intellectual capacities, moral capacities, et cetera, based on those fixed distinctions. And third, a social assignment, pushing those who are deemed less intelligent, less morally fruitful, et cetera, to the margins of a society while pushing others to the center. That's what I mean by racism. It's not exactly an elevator definition, but you know what I'm talking about. And I think that that'll be important if we want to talk about that in the Q&A. That's where I'm coming from when I talk about race in America. Now, when people talk about racism, it's important to know what we see. Some people see racism as a personal prejudice. That is to say, it's something that I have in my heart. And if that's what racism is, then what racism requires is what the Christian church would call personal repentance. If it's in my heart, then we need to repent, correct? Others say, no, it's actually relational estrangement. Racism is really about a relational breach between human beings. And if that is what is necessary, if that's what racism is, then what's necessary is racial reconciliation. And some of you have been involved in movements around racial reconciliation for a number of years. That's certainly been true in the white evangelical space, at least performatively since the 1980s. Others say, no, actually racism is not just personal, it's not just relational, it's actually institutional. And so you can think about the mass incarceration, you can think about the criminal justice institutions or educational, et cetera, and you can say, all right, well then what we need to do is institutional reform. It's a discrete series of institutional reforms. I believe all of those are true. Each one of those is true in respect. We do need personal change, we do need relational healing, we do need institutional reform. But racism is much more than any of those things. It is a cultural pathology. It is a disorder at the heart of this culture, what I would call a cultural disorder. I'm drawing on Augustine and his use of ordered loves there. This is a culture in which racism is not just in our hearts and our relationships and our institutions, but it is in the structure of our language, the structures of meaning that we assigned. It is in the very structure of our psychologies that we can look at one another and make these distinctions habitually without effort and without consciousness. That is a sign of something deeply pathological, and that is a disorder. So that's the first thing that I see. So I just want to say the first thing that led me to racism was understanding as I marched my way through these various accounts of what racism is. The thing that led me to reparations. As I marched through these various accounts of racism was recognizing that personal repentance, racial reconciliation, and institutional reform are not sufficient, because that is not what racism fundamentally has been in the West. It is a cultural disorder. Now, the second thing that I see is what is that culture? How could we describe that culture that we have here? Now, in a word that is frightening to some but obvious to others, it is a white supremacist social order. And people asked me when I was writing the book, can't you just find another way to say that? Why would I do that? Because it makes white folk comfortable, therefore reinforcing with the structure of my sentences the very logic of white supremacy itself. So we're just going to go with what it is. And the reason I say this is, you know, that the American culture was predicated upon this completely artificial distinction between white and black. Some of you will know the history of that. I wrote extensively about that in the book. But the goal of this social order, in its politics, in its healthcare, and its educational strategies, and the way that it designated the value of human beings, and its hiring practices, and the way that it developed neighborhoods, was to confer the benefits of this society on people that it designated as white, and correlatively to withhold those things from people that it designated to be not white. That's why my friend, co-author Kwon, describes himself as an honorary white person. Why? Because he lives closer to the center of the American racial hierarchy than my African American brothers and sisters do, and he has more of those benefits. That's how it has worked in his life. And so I think we have to understand that the logic for reparations comes first from a notion that racism is an expansive cultural pathology. Secondly, that cultural pathology is fundamentally the instinctive elevation of people that this culture designates to be white over others, even if it's just a psychological elevation. I grew up in a poor white family in South Carolina, and my relatives would say, we don't have white privilege. And I would say, yes, you do. It's all psychological, and every one of them knows that it is, because of the things that I hear people say at the Thanksgiving table. They know it instinctively, that there's this privilege that at least, and Du Bois says this, at least they're not black. I heard this growing up my entire life. And so this notion of privileging white, those that this culture designates to be white, is original to the founding. That's inarguable. It's pervasive across all of our institutions. I cannot think of a cultural institution in the United States that is not impacted by this, and it is enduring to this day. Right now, in our political discourse, we are banning books written by black novelists because they make us feel uncomfortable. White supremacy is original, it's pervasive, it's enduring to this day. And then that leads to the third thing. What has white supremacist culture done? What has it done to people who are not at its center, to people who are not white? In a word, that word is theft. White supremacy is fundamentally about theft. It originated in theft, the theft of bodies, and it sustains itself through theft, the theft of truth, the theft of all kinds of institutional power, the theft of wealth. And so what I want to do in the bulk of my brief time with you is to talk about this theft and just lay it out there. The essence of white supremacy is theft. First, it is the theft of truth. White supremacy sustains itself through telling lies about who we are as a people and making us believe those by putting statues to those illusions in our court squares, by teaching them in our classrooms, things like this. You know this. So there's this theft of truth takes shape in two ways. First is romanticization, okay? We romanticize who we are because we need to. We need to believe that we are just, even as we enslave other human beings. So we can, with a straight face, call ourselves the greatest nation, the greatest nation on earth. We can say that we are the beacon of freedom, and I don't care whether it's Obama or George Bush, we can say that America is the great hope for freedom in the world. Why do we say things like that? Because the truth is too painful. And so we have to romanticize these notions of who we are, and we do that through whether it's the lost cause mythology or whether it's American exceptionalism mythology, things with which you're all very familiar. But romanticization can only be sustained through its corollary, which is erasure. which is taking things away that are contrary to that, making sure those voices are not heard, making sure that those prophets are shot in the face on the balcony of the Lorraine Motel in Memphis, making sure that those memorials are not built, those manuscripts are not written, those films are not made, and those things are certainly not shown or taught in our schools in Florida and in other states in the United States. Erasure is a pathological impulse, and it is an instinct in American culture. It's an instinct. And you have to see that the way white supremacy sustains itself is precisely through that theft, okay? The theft of truth. Secondly, the theft of power. This obviously originates in the theft of bodily power, the literal abduction of human beings from their shores. It's sustained through the theft of political power, the suffrage, the right to vote, where King, of course, is talking about the passage of the Voting Rights Act, which has in many places now been eviscerated, as you know, in a way that he could not have imagined. In fact, he says that we have forever, struck a blow at the pillar of segregation, which is the franchise, and that, of course, is being rolled back. So political power, through institutional power, through people who do not believe the myths being excluded from certain forms of institutional access. And this has to do with higher education, it has to do with boardrooms, it has to do with who becomes CEOs, et cetera, et cetera. So theft of truth, theft of power, and the consequences of both of these are everywhere around us. I mean, just talking about theft of truth for a second, the reason why all of these white supremacists came to Charlottesville and at least outed themselves in 2017 was because we were going to take the Robert E. Lee statue down. That's how sacred the romanticization is. That's how powerful erasure is. And that statue and the Andrew Jackson statue, which is just down the road, were placed on top of black neighborhoods. Okay, this is what America does. It erases our protesters and then builds monuments to our own genius on top of their graves. That's what happens. And so that is so powerful that those folks came to Charlottesville. The same thing is true in the theft of power. And then lastly, the theft of wealth. This happened obviously through extraction, through black labor. And those of you who have read the book, you know that section where we talk extensively about the economic impact of black labor and black genius on the development of this culture's economy. And so that's been written about at length, and also through obstruction. All of you know that post-Civil War, certainly through Reconstruction and in an ongoing way, there are concerted efforts that are transparent to keep African Americans from gaining wealth, whether it's through mortgage restrictions, or you can't live here, or whether it's refusing to do certain kinds of lending, whether we're not going to support certain businesses. Extraction and obstruction are at the heart of the American financial theft machine. And this is what I see, that the consequences, as you know, is that African Americans now, let's just take Memphis, for example, I'm wearing this hat in honor of my brothers who were expelled from the Tennessee legislature, have 1/12 of the wealth, assets under their control that white citizens have in that city. And that's just one city. And it's true across the United States. So when I see what's happening in America, I think of racism as a cultural disorder. I think of the nature of that cultural disorder as the pathological instinct to promote people that are perceived to be white and to denigrate others. And I see that the consequences of that are massive theft of truth, theft of power, and theft of wealth. And this is what I see. Now, if that's true, then personal repentance is not going to fix that. If that's true, then racial reconciliation is not going to fix that. As somebody said to me when we were marching at the 50th anniversary of the sanitation workers' strike in Memphis, I did not march so I could be friends with you. True, exactly right. That's not going to fix that. Even discrete institutional reform, just what we're doing with mass incarceration or what we're doing with mortgage lending practices, those things are incredibly important, but they cannot fix what is happening, because what is happening is the ongoing theft and destruction of human beings in our communities, and the only thing that can fix that, in my judgment, is reparations. Now, what is reparations then? For me, and again, this is something we could talk about in Q&A, I have a slightly distinctive way of talking about reparations. It's typically understood, A, primarily against the backdrop of enslavement, and B, primarily in monetary terms, and C, primarily as a responsibility of the federal government, right? Okay, that's how it's typically conceived, and I agree with elements of all of that. But for me, enslavement is not the only theft that has happened. It is sustained through white supremacy, through the Jim Crow era, and on until today. And so white supremacy itself continues to steal. And so we can say, let's just deal with slavery while we continue to steal from slavery's heirs. That is not sufficient. And so I think what I've tried to do is say reparations is the deliberate return and repair of all that was stolen by American white supremacy. Reparations is, in my view, the return and deliberate repair of all that was stolen by American white supremacy. Now, I want to just say something as a caveat here. I know that we can't return or repair everything. That when something breaks, it is broken. When people's bodies are broken, when their children are stolen, there's no thing that we can do to repair that. So I want to make sure that everybody understands that I'm not talking about some sort of simplistic moral equivalency here. But I do think we have a responsibility to say, white supremacy has been the anchor and the source and the heart of so much that has happened in this culture. It has stolen an enormous amount, and we have to do what we teach every 6-year-old in this country to do. When you steal something, what do? You give it back. And I think the reason that we have not racially healed is because people are not even seriously willing to consider that as an option, even as we teach it to our children, because it seems too broad. Now, the same white folks that will say, you're exaggerating, this isn't that bad, are the same people that say, how can we even do this? It's too big. Okay, that shows the internal contradiction that we all experience in our lives. And so I just want to say that I think reparations, if we are to take that up as a community, we have to do it deliberately. We have to say that what was taken and continues to be taken by white supremacy is in view, and it has a threefold horizon. The first is repairing truth. We have to begin to tell the truth about what has happened in this nation. We have to do it in our schools. We have to do it in our public squares. We have to do it in the memorials that we build. We have to do it in the memorials that we take down. We have to do it in the people that we put on our currency. Over and over and over, America is a nation that is in really interesting ways and tragic ways allergic to its own truth. And we cannot heal if we cannot just tell the truth. And so I think part of what we're doing here in our landscapes, again, the memorials, the curricula, the statues, the names that we put on buildings, part of the work that we have here is to tell the truth. And that, in my judgment, is one of the first and most important commitments that local communities can make. And I want to emphasize this local community for just a moment. I believe the federal government owes reparations. As if you've read the book, you know that we have paid reparations throughout our history, not least to slave owners. At emancipation. So the American government knows how to pay reparations when it has the political will. It's just curiously unwilling to do that when it comes to black folk. And so I think we have to see that, and I'm not personally optimistic about the federal government taking this seriously, given what I see happening politically right now, which means for me it has to be local communities. I do think the federal government should do it, but I think local communities have to take responsibility to build reparations initiatives on their own, to ask what truths have been stolen here, what lies have been told, what has been erased, what has been romanticized, to have a local reckoning about these things. We can do this as a society. We also have to do a repair of power. This is about access. This is about opportunity. This is about the ability to have control of our own lives, our own educations, our own assets. This is what this is about. And I think local communities like mine in Charlottesville and like other places that I work, the task is to say, where is power happening here, and who is there and who is not there? And how do we make a self-conscious effort to change those dynamics? That seems profoundly important. It's the only way that I see that reparations of power can actually go forward. And then lastly, reparations of wealth. I believe that reparations of wealth need to be foregrounded and taken seriously in this country. Now, people say, well, wait a minute, what about the welfare programs? Weren't those reparations? No, the welfare programs are what a government does for its citizens when they are in difficult places. That's what social welfare is. Reparations is, we have stolen from you, and we will now give it back to you. And we're going to do that with an acknowledgement. We're not going to do it on the sly, right? We're going to come straight through the door and talk about that. So I do believe that the folks that I work with who are working on creating reparative communities of wealth, a lot of what their focus is on creating conditions for black wealth to grow. and for black wealth to be under black management. So that's like creating the economic conditions, creating the educational support that allow for those things. It also means investment vehicles, the creation of investment vehicles, real estate vehicles that allow African American communities to take assets under ownership and benefit from that appreciation. And then I also believe in ownership transfers. I think that that is just a fundamental thing that needs to happen, that there are things that belong to folks now that should not belong to them. And I'm one of those people. I'm a white Southern dude, okay? And there are a lot of things that we are having to, even my own family, think through, like, what does it mean? Yeah, we got this in a way that was legal, but that was immoral. And so what does it mean to return those things which were taken? And I think that's a very, very, very difficult thing to consider, especially when we are talking about one of the most valuable assets in American culture, which is land. But America's not even willing to have the basic conversation about whether the theft has occurred. But when we begin to have that, we need to know that inevitably it is going to go to land. It is going to go to real estate, and we're going to have to be pragmatic and principled about this. And so I'm going to end here because I think the most interesting things are going to happen in our discussion. But I just want to say, like, where do we go from here? I think it's where King was beginning to gesture towards going. It's where Malcolm was already gesturing toward going. It is towards reparations. And I believe that we have to take seriously the profound theft that has happened. It is a moral scourge upon all of us, and say, how can we as morally committed citizens say no more to this, and then begin the work of repairing the truth, repairing power, restoring that, and restoring wealth. And my conviction is, unless we begin to do that seriously, we're just going to be on this endless tragic cycle of repeat. Because when I read those paragraphs from King at the beginning, did you notice anything about them? They sounded like they were written on Tuesday. We are still living in this. And so I just want to say as clearly as I can, personal repentance, racial reconciliation, even discrete institutional reform are all important. But until America owns up to the truth and says we want to be a community of reparations, we will never heal. But if we do that, I believe that we can. And so I'll just leave it with that. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Greg. Trisha and Caree, will you join Greg on stage? Thank you.
Thank you, Greg, for sharing your thoughts. And I know I have a lot of questions, and I know Caree does as well. And so, Caree, I'm going to let you start with your questions, and then I have some. But
Sure, wonderful. Well, I want to start off by thanking you so much, for joining us in this conversation that has been ongoing in this local community. And I also want to, thank the audience for being courageous, for coming and being participants in this conversation as well. Reading and thinking along scholars like you and other scholars, such as Ronaldo Walcott, he argues that reparations require Black people to indulge in new fantasies of who we are and were rather than who we might become, right? And thinking of reparations beyond the logic of the economic and material, but focusing on who we are and where we, and rather than who we are to become. I'm wondering for you, from the perspective of white people, where do you think, where reparation is concerned, that kind of imagining should happen? Who we're to become or who we were? Do we go backwards? Do we go forwards for white people?
Thank you. So let me make sure I'll try to answer what I think you're asking, and if I'm wrong, just stop me and tell me.
Okay.
When I This reparations conversation is a two-party conversation. There are those who owe reparations, and there are those to whom reparations are owed. And so what I think is that my work is the work of confession, acknowledgement, truth-telling, creating collaborative situations where resources towards truth, power, and wealth can be given. But I think the African-American community is the one that needs to decide where the resources are used, who they choose to become as a community. I feel like that imagining work towards a let's call it a post-reparations future ought to belong to the African American community, and that white folks should not have the responsibility or the right to say, I think this is what it should look like. I don't know if I'm answering what you're asking.
But for white people, they should be imagining themselves in a post-reparations future about who they are as a people, or who they were, or are they supposed to be imagining themselves anew? I think that's what I'm asking. Like,
how should white folks imagine themselves?
Yes.
That's a good question. I think we have to do some work to heal our imaginations of all of the lies that exist there first. And I think part of why this is so difficult and part of why America is so resistant is because if white folks that look like me don't have whiteness, what do we have?
Right.
And so we have to, because whiteness is a fiction. It's a lie that has been socially instantiated. And when you take that away from folks, what do they have? And
that's
I think
exactly my question.
Yeah, and so I think this is part of why this is so difficult, is white Americans have to realize that this whole thing about being white is false. So it's a sociological reality, an economic reality, but in terms of an existential reality, it's false. And I think that is what we have to begin to really lean into. And I think the chaos in the streets and on Capitol Hill and all this other stuff that we're seeing, January 6th was essentially what happens when white identity is threatened. And I think we have the responsibility to say this is a lie, and we have to reimagine ourselves in a different way.
Absolutely. I recall a passage, an interview that Toni Morrison had. I can't remember it, but she was talking about, I believe it was thinking she had the upper ground, right, when people were being racist, when white people were being racist to her, because who are you without the whiteness?
Yeah.
Are you smart? Are you kind? Are you, selfless? What is this quality that you're going to strive to be once you get beyond the whiteness to which you're beholden,
That's exactly right, and exactly James Baldwin's point. He's like, you need me to be black. I'm not what you're calling me. You need me to do that, and what you need to do is look at what cultural mental illness you have. And we were just talking about this earlier at lunch. Like or at breakfast. What you're seeing in America, white America, is these are trauma responses. These are people who have fundamentally been handed a dissociative social identity. That is to say, they are being asked to believe things that they know manifestly are false. Like, even as I'm an enslaving person, I can say our black people in the South have always been real happy. That's dissociative. Okay, that is clinically dissociative. And so what you're seeing is, and the reason people dissociate is because they can't handle reality.
Right.
And what's happening is people are pushing us back towards reality, and so we put on, moose antlers and storm the Capitol. I mean, these are trauma responses, right? This is what happens.
Moose antlers. Go ahead.
I want to talk about the subtitle of your book. Okay. So the book is Reparations, a Christian Call for Repentance and Repair. And throughout the book, you make the very clear argument that the church, particularly the white church, has both a unique responsibility to engage in the work of reparations and also potential to engage in the work of reparations. And so I want you to talk about both of those things. What is the unique responsibility and what is the potential of the church to engage in this work of reparations?
Yeah, thank you. So, I am a Christian, and I'm thinking a lot of what I'm thinking out of a theological tradition. And part of why I wrote a reparations book and aimed it towards the white church was for the reasons that you are saying. First, because the culpability of white Christians in providing moral sanctuary for undeniable wickedness, this is incontrovertible. I mean, it's just, and if you just read about how people like me in denominations that I've even been a part of change baptismal liturgies so to make sure that enslaved people knew that even though they were coming into the kingdom of heaven, that they were still slaves. Like, this kind of stuff is so profoundly wicked that I think somebody needs to direct this directly. And other people are doing this. I'm not saying I'm the only person, but I wanted to address this toward the church and say, for all of the sanctimony that we experience in American largely white churches, and all of the self-righteousness and all of the, the kind of faux patriotism and all this kind of stuff, the fact is these communities have supported, sustained, sanctified, and benefited from this moral evil. If we were in Rwanda, it would be like communities that benefited from the genocide. Like, it's like that. And so we tried to do a lot to sort of say, here's the historical culpability. And and I'm somebody that was a pastor for 16 years. So I'm not just talking about those folks. Like, this is something that we did. But in terms of the power, like, the reason I said I'm a Christian is because I believe we're in the Easter season, right? And at the heart of the Christian moral vision is the vision of resurrection, and that God can work through very broken people to make things new. And so I think when you're looking at churches, what you see is you see financial resources, you see people who are morally committed, you see people who want to love their neighbors. Often you see that. You see people who have institutional connections, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that instead of looking for the government or for the state house to figure this out for us, this is a community whose core identity is supposed to be about neighbor love. And the fact that white churches are not willing to do this, it really would be like going to Rwanda in the mid-1990s and just not doing anything about the genocide, just not talking about it. And that is what I see. There's a culpability there, and then there's also this potential if we would just say, you know what, this is right. We've seen parts of this in the church in South Africa. We see it in other parts. We saw this in Germany. We saw this in the German Reformed Church take reparations seriously. And I don't think people have directly, well, James Foreman did it in 1968, but I don't see white leaders saying to their communities, this is our responsibility. What I see white leaders doing is saying, we are being victimized by the Marxists. And that is tragic.
Yeah, I gave you a couple statistics at lunch, and I want to share them with the group, which are just striking to me, and just have you reflect on them. And that is that the Barna Research Group, which does studies on American Christianity, in 2019, when they surveyed white Christians, so 2019, 23% of practicing white Christians indicated they were unmotivated to address racial justice. So that's 2019, 23%. And then in July of 2020, this is after the killing of George Floyd, 36% of practicing white Christians gave the same response. So the number went up from 23 to 36. Can you talk about that? What does that say?
Yeah, barely. I think that it's just one of the most grotesque things I've ever seen, which is the whole world watched a man get murdered and then watched African Americans, black and brown, young folks, white folks rise up and say, enough of this. And within 2 months, the American Evangelical Church changed the subject to critical race theory. It was, I remember I wrote about it in July of 21. I was like, why are we talking about critical race theory? What is going on? Critical race theory is not the problem. White supremacy is the problem. We changed the subject. And it's like, if you look at the parable of the Good Samaritan, we, the folks that just looked at that and went to the other side of the road and said, we are not going to deal with this. And we made ourselves the victims. We have convinced ourselves that our children are now being victimized by some Marxist campaign under the brand of critical race theory, which only like 3 people who talk about this publicly have any idea what they're talking about. And that is what has happened. I think that American political leaders knew how to ignite the pathology because in white communities there is an invisible gas that makes us sick. And there are fools and villains that know how to ignite that. And they did. And so suddenly we weren't talking about the tragedy of this man being murdered. We were talking about how wealthy white folks are victims. And that, I mean, you can set your watch by this. This is straight out of J. Edgar Hoover's playbook. When black people start talking about liberation, white people start talking about Marxism. You can set your watch by it. And that, and the church is 100% susceptible to that. And that's historically true. But before Marx, they were calling it un-American. But since the Red Summer and all that, all that stuff you all know about, that's what happens. And I think that's what's happened to the church. And right now we are watching political leaders win office, very influential office, by exploiting transparent nonsense. And it's just, it makes me think, I mean, King says this. He's like, I don't think white folk and black folk serve the same God in America. And it makes me think that the church in America that has sustained witness to the kingdom of God is the black church. It's not in the heart of the American evangelical Protestant, in spite of all of our protestations and our seminary degrees, because we are watching a man get murdered and then make ourselves the victim. And I think that's what I see happening.
Wonderful. Where did critical race theory hit you?
What's that?
I'm just speaking in Jacob. Where did critical race theory punch you?
Yeah, all over.
Punch me in the eye.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, suddenly people who like have never thought about anything are bringing up critical race theory at Thanksgiving. You're like, what? What is happening right now?
Deep.
Yeah. That's something, isn't it?
But along the lines of stolen history and truth, following up on Dr. Posey. And you talk about the German Reformed Church and think about the Protestants and evangelicals. And we've discussed this in our own group here, this idea of white Christians, since that's an arm, having that arm within the church, being missionaries unto white communities. If you think that would be an effective method of cultivating this new kind of world or new kind of truth that we would seek to disseminate. What are your feelings about that?
So whether white Christians ought to see themselves as missionaries to white communities?
Instead of going to Uganda and going to Rwanda, go to Alabama. Go to Arkansas.
Yeah, as far as I can tell, Uganda is not banning Toni Morrison books. so, yeah, I mean,
what would that look like?
Yeah, so when I was a pastor, I was like, look, we are this non-cloistered monastery missionary community that is trying to bear witness to the living God in the midst of nationalist paganism. And I mean it just as straight as that. Because people are, I mean, if you think about like the old missionary stories in the Christian church, I'm talking about like, very, very early pre-modern stuff. They're going into communities that are, in their own judgment, like captive to false deities, to false narratives about who they are, to profoundly destructive social mores, and these people can't see it. And a part of, at its best, what the Christian church has done is borne witness to a different way of being. Mm-hmm. The problem here is that in many white churches, we have simply sanctified an existing way of being and called it God's will. And I don't know how, I mean, King said this in his of all places, Playboy interview, where he basically said, he was interviewed by Playboy magazine, he said the black church is a missionary movement to white America, because they need to be saved, because they are sick, because the God that they're worshiping is not the God that would do the things that are happening here. I think he's 100% right. And so, I mean, I'm essentially doing the work I'm doing as a Christian. Now, whether it's effective or not, that's a whole other thing. Sometimes bearing witness to the gospel gets you crowned emperor. Sometimes it gets you fed to the lions. I don't know which it is, and it doesn't much matter to me. But the point is, this has to be the message that our neighbors are captive to a cult of nationalism that is destroying them and destroying their children and destroying our neighbors and making us fools before the world. And that, I feel like, if there aren't Christian leaders that are willing to say that, I don't know what they're doing. I really don't know what they're doing.
You say a couple of times in the book something, I'm going to read a quote from the book, but something along these lines, which really struck me and was convicting to me. You say many institutions, in the name of stewardship, prefer to remain in control even as they give. This suggests an overly romanticized view of the white community's capacity to use wealth in a virtuous way. It hits at that romantic view of ourselves in history. And it suggests the lingering presence of diminished conceptions of Black identity. So in other words, even in engaging in the work of reparations, whites can do so under white supremacy.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So how do we, in the white community, address that? Address the white supremacy that sometimes can infect even the work of reparations?
That's a great question. Some of y'all, one of my heroes is James Lawson, who was very involved in the movement with King, and I worked with him in Memphis, and he uses the phrases that a lot of people use now, plantation capitalism. Mm-hmm. And there's a thing going on in the philanthropy world, where if you're an African American working to get grants, you're familiar with the phrase like the plantation philanthropic machine. You know, some people call it the philanthropy industrial complex. And what happens is we're in the communities, we see what's happening, we're trying to put these grants together, and we've got to somehow go and dance for some program officer, and then spend all of our time like writing reports to make sure that they are satisfied with what's happening, when what really needs to happen is the shift of control of assets to Black communities. That's what needs to happen, because as long as white, you see this in white folk, you know this is true. You know that as soon as somebody starts talking about giving money and transferring assets to Black community, that somebody in their heart and somebody's crazy uncle is going to say, well, what if they waste it? Mm-hmm. Okay, that's what everybody's going to say.
Yeah.
And my friend Anasa Troutman, who I quoted in the book, basically was like, how profligate and wasteful have white men been with money? These men waste money all the time on wars that the world doesn't need, trillions of dollars. And we're going to say we can't trust this matriarch of the Black community to take, $1.5 million and invest it. This is lunacy. This is basic white supremacy, and I do think that one of the things this calls for is a reconsideration of how assets are stewarded. Now, I do mean consideration. We have to think about, like, what does this mean? Because all these families, some of y'all know there's like pretty wealthy families in Northwest Arkansas who like to start big businesses, right? And yet remain in control of those assets. And that's how people think. They just think, well, we're in control and we're just going to do good. So we're going to go hire the geniuses who went to the London School of Economics or the Kennedy School or whatever. We're going to put them on our payroll and they're going to tell us what we should do with them. What if you let the people from whom those assets were ultimately taken have them back? Do you know how much Black genius there is? Do you know what kind of genius it took to survive slavery and to survive Jim Crow and to create the music, the scholarship, the fashion, the community, the food? We're talking about giving money to the people who have demonstrated the most incredible genius in the history of the West. That's what we're talking about. So I think that one of my concerns about philanthropically driven reparations, although I think, we got roughly $700 billion in the philanthropic economy of the United States, is a lot that needs to be involved. But we have to have a serious conversation. And and now in the corporate philanthropy world, it's even getting bigger than that. We have to have serious conversations about what does it mean to create structures that those assets can be given to. so that are under African American control, rather than us just hiring a black program officer and convincing ourselves that we're doing anti-racist work. Does that get it?
Yeah, thank you.
Yes.
I can be a little too on the
Okay.
nose sometimes, sorry.
Okay, looks like we have a question already.
I'm going to have to take issue a little bit with you on that because I work for a nonprofit and we make business loans primarily to minority-owned business owners. We make business loans to Communities Unlimited. If anybody knows, it's based here in Fayetteville. We're in 7 southern states. We do housing for low-income areas to try to help build wealth through the largest asset of your house and your business. Because if you can't start with that wealth in your own business, and then we provide education to help that business owner know you've got to transfer that wealth to your next generation. That's what the white man did. And if you just have your business and die, you haven't done that. You've got to continue with this wealth. And yes, our loan loss ratio is much higher than banking. But I was Christian. I was raised Christian. And I think the reversal of the white church is less likely to happen than the nonprofits to do their work. And yes, those big three names, actually we've got them, Ford Foundation all over, give us quite a bit of money. And we have to report that we lent it to those minorities. And we can make a difference, I think, more with the nonprofit world than those white Christians who can't get it out of their mind. Your question about stewardship. Here's your money. Now you've got to prove what you did with it is better. In the nonprofit world, we don't do that. We say, go for it, and you have control over it. Yeah, you got to pay us back. Yeah, we want you to learn how to grow your business, but it's yours, your decisions, and we'll support you however we can. So.
Well, thank you for that.
I do want to read your book, though.
Well, thank you. Well, thank you for that, too. But I think we're saying the same thing. I also am involved in a nonprofit, and I'm a part of a grant-giving organization. I do think that if you look at what you're doing, which is, as you've just described it, it seems to me exactly one of the things that needs to be happening. But compared that with national philanthropic trends, it's like it's a different model. At least historically it has been. Now that we have an African American director, both the Mellon and the Ford Foundations, some of that is starting to shift. But the general point that I'm trying to make is that philanthropy is not immune from the same sorts of cultural logics of control that every other institution is. That's not to say that every example of that, I would explicitly not say that, is doing that. But I think as just a general point, we can't just say, all right, well, what if just all the white foundations just started supporting stuff. At some point there has to be a shift in control of assets. And I hear you saying that too. Like, we're giving these people, they have control of their assets. We're saying the same thing. I'm just making a more general point about that needing to be more consistent across philanthropy than it is, because it isn't consistent across philanthropy what you just described. I mean, in terms of grant-making organizations around the United States, it's just not the case that $700 billion is being transferred under black control. So, yes.
Hi. Thank you for making that distinction. Also, my name is Clarice Abdul-Bey. I am one of the conveners of the Arkansas Peace and Justice Memorial Movement, where we honor and memorialize victims of racial terror lynchings in the state of Arkansas. Arkansas has the highest number of lynchings of 493 in the state. We are the third highest in the country. What I wanted to, I guess address, not even address, but you mentioned about showing up in community, and in a lot of the things that we've learned, basically it's about how to enter and exit communities. A lot of times there are well-meaning white organizations that come into the communities not knowing how to enter them, and in ways that when they exit, they leave the community more destitute and more codependent than they were when they showed up. And the main thing that I think needs to happen whenever your organization or your nonprofit is coming into Black and predominantly Black communities is that the respect of the elders and the folks who are in that community, the cultural empathy and cultural competency needs to be there. And also making sure that you are connecting with that community in ways that you're not showing up, parachuting in, and being ending up being a white savior of that community, but you are leading in ways that create repair and also create sustainability. There are large companies who have done that. I won't mention names, but just throughout the world, thinking that they were helping, and they have left these communities destitute because now they are codependent because they have gone in, done that, and then left them without any source of sustainability to sustain the community. So thank you for your writings, and thank you for what you're doing, and thank you for bringing to the forefront that if you're going to be an organization, white-led organization, also make sure that you have folks that represent the community running things, and also your boards represent the communities that you are trying to handle, take care of. So that's important.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hey, everybody. I think one of the things that needs to happen too is that the patronizing or the, teaching us what, to say, like, this is how white people did it. It's not necessarily the way we want to go. We have wonderful ideas, and it needs to be, I think, a partnership, whatever it is, because we're grown-ups, and people feel it when when our relationship is one of patronization. We can feel it, and so people need training about how to eliminate some of that white supremacist position. It's just you're using the same you're talking as if you're still in the same position. Here I am, a white supremacist, and I'm going to show you how to do whatever. We can tell. Even if you're wonderful, that you're coming from a space that is not of equality and respect.
So what I'm hearing you say is that maybe whiteness is not the model that Black people potentially want to follow, right? And even though that might have brought wealth and riches to white communities, maybe making communities more important. And actually, I was going to follow that up with a question for you about, given that we live in this kind of a capitalist structure that defines so much of what we do, right? And shapes so much of our thinking, shapes so much of the philanthropy world, the models, the white Protestant work ethic, how do we, in thinking about reparations, think beyond this structure that shapes so much of how we think and conceive of ourselves in the world and where we can go and what we can do?
That's an awesome question. Thank you. And I don't know the answer, so I'll just narrate what my struggle has been. It was that Einstein quote about you can't solve a problem with the same model that created the problem. Mm-hmm. I think that there has to be like very, very clear work to say, on the one hand, people need wealth. They need assets under their control. They need homes. They need the things that you were mentioning. They need these things made available and supported. On the other hand, we can't do it in a way that that destroys community, because, like, you know, one of the things that everybody knows if you study capitalism is that there are all kinds of adjacent consequences to the human self, the human communities, to the land, to all of these other things. And so it's not just like we want to make these great resources that have created an economic superpower available to you. What we need to do is say, this thing is part of the problem. It's the reason we're struggling with all of this. So we have to simultaneously be able to develop wealth, but do it in a way that doesn't reproduce the extractive logic that created the problem in the first place. And I don't know, I'm not an economist. I can smell when things start getting in that direction. But I do think you're exactly right. This is why, and you know this is why King at the end of his life was like, wait a minute, racism is a problem, but it is also capitalism, and it's also militarism, which is, say, the violence through which we enforce these things. And so I think he was trying to do that economic work, and I think that's really important. And let me just say one more thing. One of the reasons I think it's important not just to make reparations economic is because it can inadvertently play into this like commodification logic, like everything that happened was just economic, and if we can assign a dollar value to this, then we've somehow done the thing. That is using the model that caused the problem to solve the problem. And so I think part of the work, and I don't know how to do this yet, because honestly, people have been writing about reparations, people have been doing work on reparations, but if you look at the state of the conceptual state of the movement, it's fairly disintegrated. It's early days. It feels like we've got Pfizer, Moderna, and Johnson & Johnson out there trying to figure out how to do reparations work, but we haven't come to any sort of like broad conceptual. We don't even have any real tests. Like we're learning more and more. One happened yesterday in Pittsburgh. Pittsburgh Penguins gave back land to an AME church, Bethel AME church. The city had taken that, yeah. So the city took that, destroyed the second largest AME church in the United States at the time. Yesterday, signed a contract to give that land back. So there are examples, all local examples. Just remember, local is where this is going to happen. But I think we still don't know what it will look like. I sure don't know.
To that point, I want to read another quote from your book. You say, the true imperative of reparations is not simply for a debt to be repaid, but for an entire world to be repaired, which is what you've been telling us here today. I can see a lot of people reading that line and thinking, I don't even know where to start. If the theft was so comprehensive, wealth, power, truth, all these things, where do we even start?
Yeah, didn't y'all, when you start talking about this stuff, feel a low-grade depression rolling in? Yeah, because I feel like this. I feel like if you do this work, it kind of commits you to a low-grade sense of being overwhelmed and confused, whether that takes the form of rage or depression or sardonic humor, it'll be up to your personality. But I think that. I think reparations, repairing our world, like that's overwhelming. That's overwhelming to think about. But I think if we break it down into discrete issues, so for example, what lies were told in fable and are still being told? What stories were erased? What cemetery was paved over? What building was taken from a black community and not given back? It gets suddenly pretty small. Now that feels overwhelming, but that's not overwhelming in scale. That's overwhelming in the amount of resistance that you're going to face. And I think this is why breaking things down into local size is going to be the way that this goes forward. Because I'm like, when I just look You ever seen that graphic that somebody put together about all the slave ships leaving Africa?
Slavevoyages.org.
Slavevoyages.org. It has. If you haven't seen it, you should see it. It's a time lapse of all the slave ships leaving. Now, while you're watching, I want you to watch it just the first time, just to take it in. The second time, I want you to watch it. I want to watch what's happening to you emotionally while you're watching it. Because by the time, Lord, by the time you're in like the early 19th century, I just want to go throw open a trash can and like watch, some television that's going to make me never think about this again. That can be overwhelming, but when you break it down to one thing, one place, one lie that we can undo, that becomes much more manageable and much more powerful, I think. So I really think local communities have to be the place. And what if somebody said, just if you could wave a wand, what would you do? I would want to create reparations task forces in every city and say, let's do this work. We don't know what it's going to be like. None of us really knows what to do. We know what the 12 steps are, the 12 points of the Caribbean reparations group is, and we know this has happened in Germany. We know this happened in South Africa. We don't really know what we should do here. If we could just go in that and say, we're trying to create a vaccine. We don't know exactly how to do it, but we create these communities as laboratories. I think we would see some super cool stuff happening, because a lot of it's already happening anyway, but I think we would see it, and then we would learn what to do, I think.
What was that website again?
Slavevoyages.org. It's quite interesting how, we simultaneously bring the future close and then far away, depending on what it is. Black people, are told, get over it, move past. It was so long ago. But every year you celebrate 4th of July, and you can recall all these things. It's like people become lay historians, can recall all the battles, all the this and all of that. But black people should get over that history. And we don't know. How are we going to know how many slaves? How are we going to know who, And so the kind of mental gymnastics that happen to kind of push that in such a distant past, so as to befuddle or to render the possibilities, null. It's kind of very interesting mental game.
Yeah, interesting in the fact that almost hilarious. There was a guy who wrote a review of this book. This pastor who wrote a review of the Reparations book, and it was like ironic in tone, but it had this kind of, it's so long ago, and it's like so hard, and like white people are just trying to live their lives. They're not trying to like actively enslave black people. That same dude prayed a prayer at his church, because I went and listened to it, in his sermon on July 4th, and he was like, Lord, thank you that we have inherited these great promises, and let us steward and take these forward. And I was like, all right, hold on. This dude can claim the mantle of America when it's awesome, but suddenly he's bewildered by the complexity of history when it comes to figuring out how we're going to repair something.
Right.
That is, remember, mental illness is a really useful category if you think about it. It really is, and I'm not saying that to be pejorative. I just think there's so much really important work going on with trauma right now that once you get inside of that, you're like, oh, this is what this is. These folks don't even know that they're doing this. They're having a trauma response. That's what it is. And it's because when white folks, and again, look at me. I'm a white boy from South Carolina, right? When we start talking about this, we go to this part of our brain. White folks go to this part of our brain. We're talking, it's fear. It's fear. That's what it is. And if you have kids, or if you've ever been in an argument with somebody, that you don't say intelligent things when you are threatened. And so I think part of what we just have to recognize is this is terror that we're dealing with. And that doesn't mean we have to accommodate it, but we need to recognize it and not be surprised, because this really is, I think, what's happening. I'm a psychiatrist. But I see one.
Kind of in line with what you were just talking about, Greg, but what is your advice to white folk who are interested in engaging in this work? Oftentimes when white people are not centered, it's an emotional response. I want to do something. but it doesn't last. So what is your advice to white folk to stay engaged and committed to this work?
That's a great question. I think if you think about reparations, if you're a white person, you think about reparations, and you think about being in a meeting on reparations, and then you think about being in a meeting on reparations that you're not leading, and that's uncomfortable for you, then we have to start with that. We have to start with this need to control the terms of the debate, to say, well, I wish you wouldn't say that. You know, she can be a little more much. You know, or like when you find that kind of thing coming up inside of you, that's when you're hitting the fear part. And so I think, I honestly think that to stay involved in this work, we have to continue to educate ourselves about this, because if you just read like Jamar's book, or if you read my book and then you don't do anything else, it's not gonna stick. I live and breathe this. So it's all I do. So I think part of that is being engaged and thinking about that. I think part of it is, I think a lot of folks, and I mean that this is not pejorative, I think folks who do this work who are white should go to therapy. because that is a place where you can begin to see some of the stuff that's coming out in you, and you didn't know it was there, and you don't know what to do, but black folks don't have to bear the burden of it. They don't have to explain this to you. Somebody else can help you see that. And then I really think that other than that, figuring out a project that you can get inside, somebody that you can follow, and just staying in it. I don't know how else to do it other than that. But it's not going to be easy. We're trying to unmake our own imaginations and remake them, and then remake the world that was made in the image of that bad imagination. I mean, it's like it's civilizational. And so I think just knowing that can be thrilling, but knowing that and just breaking it down into small parts is the only way I know to sustain.
That was going to be it seems like that's the twin process. It's therapy and reparations, right? I've been reading Resmaa Menakem's book, My Grandmother's Hand, right? And the body keeps the score, in recent times. And that is indeed, right? When we talk about white supremacy and how the body, holds that. And the resistance you're going to feel when you're having those conversations, and it's difficult, that inner child, that inner person, the inner whiteness in you, when it rears that head, and you need the self-awareness to be like, ask, what is that?
Yeah, that's exactly right.
How can what is this? What does this mean for me? Or as a church body, I'm wondering if that needs to be a part of active, because this is about a Christian call, if, and Christians go to God, right? And it's almost like, I know in the black church we substitute a lot of therapy, although I know St. James is not, we advocate therapy. But we often substitute therapy, Jesus for therapy, and I'm wondering if that should be advocated, if activism needs to be calling for that to be a significant part of church. Or part of.
So if I was a multimillionaire, I'm not. If I was, I would be, in addition to thinking about the work that we're talking about here, I would be thinking about the intersection of trauma healing and race for both black and white folks. Because I'm leading the project to build a national memorial of the Underground Railroad. This is outside of Philadelphia. It's a huge project, right? But one of the first calls I made was to a psychiatrist that said, white folks and black folks are both going to be traumatized when they come to this, but for different reasons and in different ways. How can we how can we build the insights of trauma therapy into the programming, so that people are coming in and thinking, and what's happening in their bodies, attention is being drawn to what's happening in their bodies as they're looking at the exhibit. Because usually if you go to an exhibit, my partner in this company is in Voices Underground. He's a black guy, and we go to say EJI Memorial in Montgomery, or we go to the Legacy Museum. We lead trips there for people every year. Something's going on in his body, and something very different is going on in my body, but we both feel terrible. but nobody is giving us the language for what to do with that. So
Yeah.
we just go and look at each other and go, like, you want to go get a drink or something? I don't know. I don't know what to do. So you have to like figure out in the programming. And I just was doing a bunch of trauma therapy work myself. And we had a retreat where we invited a bunch of African American leaders who were working in social justice and said, what do you need? Like, what do you most need? And they all said, trauma care. We need somebody to start a fund to pay for African-American trauma-informed therapists, healers, chiropractors, that stuff, and we need money to send our community to see these people because we cannot afford it. And if I had money, that is what I would do right now.
Guys, I will keep talking. Dr. Pastor has a question.
Thanks, Greg, for coming. I'm Dustin McGowan. I have a question related to a couple of times it's come up, this kind of like exporting of whiteness as a part of the process of healing in black communities. And one of the things that I think is missed is the theft of black autonomy, right? And so what are the first things that are stolen in slavery, right, is cultural identity, personal, your name, your language, your culture, your customs, right? And so even after, the Civil War and post-Civil War Reconstruction era America, black people are like, hey, we just want to exist and create our own communities to thrive, right? When what we tend to have set as the benchmark, right, is, hey, for black people to thrive, that means that they want to live like us, right? That they want our wealth, they want our type of communities. And so kind of what we saw after the end of desegregation, right? When you have the social phenomenon of black flight, of black people leaving black communities and moving into white communities, because the goal of what success was whiteness, right? Which is what in the end is a continual perpetuation of the initial problem of the theft of autonomy and culture and identity, right? And so I think one of the major blind spots, as you have mentioned, I got here late that you mentioned towards the end of your talk, is this failure for white people to understand what whiteness is and what their own culture is and what that has played out how that has played out historically, right? And we talk about power and domination and control, right? And how that clashes, right, with the ability to do repair, right? You cannot do repair out of that framework. And so there needs to be a completely new framework, paradigm, created in order to do the repair, right? Because what you become an importer of is whiteness, which again perpetuates the problem that already exists. And so how do we, right, free, right, black bodies back to their own personal autonomy, which is what, in the resilience of black people, they have done, right, on their own, right, which is why black culture globally is probably the most popular culture in the world, right? That recreation of that from nothing, right? And so how do you step back, right, to understand what we are not moving people towards is not an equality with what our existence of thriving, what that means for us, but allow people to create that framework for themselves.
That's such an incredibly important question. Thank you. Like everything else, I don't really know the answer except to just honor what you've said and say that in my own work, and I'm a white guy, right? So this is part of the struggle. In my own work, I have to look and constantly say, is this a cultural norm that I'm talking about here that I'm wanting to import, or is this like a good, like how do I do that? And the only way I know how to do that is in community, with other folks to say like, no, actually this is, we also want to do this, you know. And I think that's part of when we were having the philanthropy conversation, that's part of what I think we're talking about is like, you can go in and say, okay, this is how you build wealth. And because, no, this is how you build wealth. How we build wealth is like this. And I think that those are the conversations that are not currently happening. Program officers come up and say, this is what it means. We've looked at best practices, which means we read the Harvard Business Review. And so now what we're going to do is we're going to hold everybody hostage to that, rather than saying, what amazing thing have you done that we could now support and interpret. And I think this is just white supremacy it lurks its head at every place. It threatens to choke out the life of what we're doing. So I appreciate you saying that. And I think part of what's interesting, that's not at the heart of what you were saying, is that when you were talking about earlier, what do white folks do when we realize that the thing that we inhabited is a cage for other people and for ourselves, and we don't want to be a part of that anymore? I think it's a real question for white folks. Where do we go? Like, what do we do? It's almost like, how do we learn how to be human beings outside of that? So I think there's a lot of complexity to how we answer that question, and I just don't know all the answers.
So much of it has to do with the way that white folks juxtapose and kind of insert whiteness into humanness, so that distinction cannot be separated out. And it's oftentimes, right, it's black folks who know whiteness intimately, right? In the autobiography of the Ex-Colored Man, James Weldon Johnson said, the people of this country know and understand white people than the white people know and understand themselves. Or as W.E. Du Bois wrote in The Souls of White Folk, of them I am singularly clairvoyant. I see in and through them, I see their souls undressed. And from the back and the side, I see the working of their entrails. I know their thoughts and they know that I know. Or as the sociologist recently said, know your whites. So it's, white people don't think like they know about black culture and what foods go with that and like what is white culture. And to interrogate that seriously and deliberately, right, I think can do a lot of good in freeing white people from that kind of thing.
Yeah, that's so brilliant. Y'all ever read Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man? If you haven't, you should go get it now and read it. The first two white people that you see in that book, the first one is blind, and the second is a group of drunk white men. This is not accidental. I mean, there's the theme in Black literary history of white inebriation and cluelessness about what actually is going on inside of us is very strong, and it's in what you just said is totally right. Those are great continuations of that same thread. I love that.
Wonderful.
Or Baldwin's the myth of white innocence.
Yes.
All right, I'm not sure who's in charge. What numbers
I
now?
think Lowell.
Lowell.
It is 3:29. I'll just stay back here. I'll go up there so you guys don't have to turn around. So I'll be brief. Thank you, Greg, Caree, Trisha, for being with us today. Yeah, give them a hand. And thank you all for being here today for this really important, but I think we all feel like not easy conversation. I'm not walking out of here with like answers to big problems, but I am hopeful that we have gathered here to try to face these things together. And that, as Suzanne asked, the question about what does it look like for us to continue, that we as a community can continue to face these things together. So with that, Betty, if you will, Betty's going to share an announcement of an opportunity to continue the conversation. with some future programming. After Betty's announcements, we can conclude. Greg will be available in the back to sign copies of the book, and y'all be free to go. So thank you, and here you go, Betty.
Thanks, Lowell, and thank you guys so much for all that we talked about. And as we've said over and over and over through this whole thing, is that this is an ongoing conversation, and there's so much to unpack, so much to learn, so much to confront, and at times it's like, holy moly, I need to get a drink and just check out, and disassociate and take a step away, and to kind of walk away, and because it's so overwhelming. But we want to create an opportunity to really press into that as a community, to look at this difficult conversation that is so complex over time, so that it's not just one big event and go forth and do reparations on your own, it's not really the vibe. So what we're hoping to do is have a book study kind of from this discussion initially, but in a community to really unpack little bits through of Greg's book and just talk about, honestly, like, what does this look like for us as a community locally, and how can we participate in that? And so we're kind of still going through what that will look like structurally, but it will most likely be twice a month in the late summer, early fall, and just keep your eyes out for an email from us. And if you've RSVP'd, if you haven't RSVP'd, RSVP, because then we'll have your email and can let you know when that book study is coming up. But yeah, I think that's everything. Yeah? Cool. Sweet. Thanks, guys.